During my third month in a fire tower in Montana, I realized something came out of the forest every single night. It never climbed the tower. It just stood at the bottom of the ladder, watching me. The thing about a fire lookout posting is that you apply for it the way you apply for anything you don't expect to get. I filled out the form in February, in my apartment in Missoula, sitting at a kitchen table, covered in the evidence of a life that had recently stopped making sense. Divorce papers on one side, a letter from my former employer on the other, the kind of letter that uses the word restructuring 4 times in 2 paragraphs and means something simpler and less polite. I was 38 years old and I had, in the space of 11 months, lost the 2 structures that had organized my time, and I was filling out a form for a seasonal fire lookout position with the Bitterroot National Forest, because a friend had mentioned it once, years ago, as the kind of thing you do when you need to be somewhere that is not where you are. The posting was for Garnet Peak Lookout, a staffed fire detection tower on a ridge in the Sapphire Range, southeast of Hamilton. Elevation 5,600 feet, staffed May through October. 1 person, no road access after the first snow, and the first snow, in those mountains, comes early. The job description was straightforward. Maintain visual watch for smoke during daylight hours. Log weather observations 4 times daily. Report confirmed smokes to dispatch by radio. Maintain the tower and the surrounding area. The pay was modest. The isolation was not mentioned explicitly, but the job description used the phrase, extended solitude twice, which is the Forest Service's way of saying that most people last about 3 weeks before they request a transfer. I was not most people, or I told myself I was not most people, and so I sent the form, and I forgot about it. And in March I got a call from a district ranger in Hamilton named Boyd, a man with the flat, deliberate speech of someone who has spent a long time talking on radios, who asked me 2 questions. The first was whether I had any history of heart problems, because the hike-in was steep and they'd had a situation a few years back. The second was whether I was comfortable being alone. I said yes to both. He said the position was mine if I wanted it, and that orientation was the first week of May, and that I should bring enough food for 2 weeks because resupply by mule was unreliable before the trails dried out. I said fine. He said good. Neither of us said anything else, and that was the hiring process. I want to be honest about the state I was in when I arrived at Garnet Peak, because I think it matters for what came after. I was not well. I was not dramatically unwell. I was not in crisis. I was not medicated. I was not the kind of person whose mental state would have raised a flag in a standard assessment. I was the kind of person who was very tired, in a way that had no single cause and no obvious remedy, and who had decided that the best response to a life that had come apart was to go somewhere that had never been assembled in the first place. This is not wisdom. I understand that now. At the time, it felt like the clearest thought I'd had in a year. The hike-in was 4.5 miles, on a maintained trail that gained 2,200 feet from the trailhead. I had a pack of 40 pounds, which was too much, and I knew it was too much before I started, and I did not reduce it, because I was afraid of running out of the things that I thought I needed, which turned out to be mostly the wrong things. I arrived at the tower in the early afternoon of the 8th of May, sweating and slow, and I stood at the base of the cab ladder and looked up at the structure for the first time. A fire lookout tower, if you have never seen one, is a thing that takes a moment to absorb. The cab, the small glass-walled room at the top, sits on a steel frame that lifts it 60 feet off the ridge. The frame is guyed with cables anchored in concrete, and in a high wind the whole structure moves, not dramatically, but perceptibly, a slow lean and return that you feel more in your inner ear than in your legs. The cab itself is perhaps 14 feet square, glass on all 4 sides, with a narrow catwalk running around the outside. It is entirely visible from every direction, which is the point. A fire lookout must see, and must also be seen, because visibility and accountability are the same thing at altitude. There is nowhere to hide. Everything that happens in the cab happens in full view of the sky. I climbed the ladder. The cab was unlocked. Inside, a cot against the south wall, a propane two-burner stove, a small table with the firefinder mounted in the center, the Osborne firefinder, a rotating alidide on a topographic map disc, the instrument you use to take a bearing on a smoke and report it to dispatch, a radio on a shelf above the table, a logbook, a barometer, a rain gauge, 2 windows on each wall, all of them capable of opening outward, a trapdoor in the floor where the ladder came up. That was everything. The cab smelled of old wood and something mineral, a faint sulfur undertone that I later learned was the smell of lightning, which strikes the tower and the surrounding ridgeline regularly and leaves a trace in the wood and the metal that never entirely goes away. I stood in the center of the cab and turned slowly, looking out through the glass at the mountains in every direction. To the west, the Bitterroot Valley, the town of Hamilton reduced to a gray smear in the haze. To the east, the sapphires rising to the crest, ridge after ridge, dark with timber. To the south, the country opened into a long, timbered plateau that ran toward the Montana-Idaho line. To the north, nothing remarkable. More ridges, more forest, a single patch of open slope where a slide had cleared the timber and left a pale scar. I noted all of this. I noted it because it was my job to note it, and because the noting of it was the beginning of the work, which was the beginning of the structure that I had come here to find. I set up my food. I made the cot. I located the water tank, which was filled by a pipe from a spring 50 yards down the east slope, and I verified it was full. I read the logbook, which contained entries from the previous occupant, a man named Dell, based on the handwriting, who had staffed the tower for 3 seasons before me, and who wrote in the short, observational style of someone accustomed to official records, weather, smokes, maintenance issues. The entries were dated and timed and unremarkable, and I read them the way you read the history of a place you have just arrived in, looking for the things that will matter to you, and finding mostly the things that mattered to someone else. Dell's last entry was from the previous October, 3 days before season end. It noted a weather change, dropping temperatures, the first dusting of snow on the upper ridges. It noted a radio check with dispatch at 0800. It noted, at the bottom of the page, in smaller writing than the rest, Osborne off by 3 degrees on 215 bearing. Check alignment before season open. This was practical information, and I noted it. I did not note anything else in the entry, because there was nothing else in the entry. It was a final log from a person closing down a post, thorough and flat and final. I started my own entries the following morning. I will tell you how those first weeks went, because the ordinariness of them is the context for what came later. I woke at 6. I took a weather observation. I logged it. I ate. I began my watch at first light and maintained it through the day, sweeping the country with the binoculars at regular intervals, learning the terrain, building the visual vocabulary that fire detection requires. You must know the country before you can read it. You must know where the fog collects in the morning, which drainages hold smoke from campfires on still days, which patches of timber are the right color green, and which have the faint gray cast of dying trees, stressed by beetle or drought, the kind of fuel that burns hot and fast. You must learn to look at the same landscape for 8 hours a day, without your eyes flattening it into wallpaper. This is harder than it sounds. I was good at it, or I became good at it quickly, which I think had something to do with the fact that I had nothing else to do. I had brought books, and I read them in the evenings. I had a journal, and I wrote in it, though the entries were sparse in those first weeks, amounting mostly to weather data and the names of birds I could identify from the tower. I had a radio, and twice a day, morning and evening, I checked in with dispatch, a brief exchange of weather and watch status, with a rotating cast of voices on the other end that I came to recognize but never formally met. I had the Osborne, which I realigned on the first clear day, using a surveyed bearing to a known peak, finding Dell's 3-degree error and correcting it. I had the logbook. I had the mountains. What I did not have, or what I found I did not have more completely than I had expected, was any sense of being watched. I want to say this carefully, because it will seem like a strange thing to miss. But I had spent my adult life in cities, in offices, in a marriage, in all the continuous low-level awareness that comes from being surrounded by other people, the sense that your actions are witnessed and therefore real. Here, there was no one. The sky watched, in the way the sky always watches, which is to say not at all. The forest watched, in the way forests are said to watch, which is a literary idea and not a real one. I was, for the first time in my life, genuinely alone, and the experience of it was not peaceful. It was vertiginous. It was the feeling of a tightrope walker who discovers, mid-wire, that no one is looking. I adjusted. People adjust. By the third week I had found a rhythm, the kind that imposes itself when there is nothing to interrupt it, and the vertiginous feeling receded, and I began to understand the tower and the country around it, in the way you understand a room you have lived in for years, not by thinking about it, but by knowing where everything is without looking. The first thing I noticed was the silence on the north slope. I need to explain the geography of the ridge. The tower sat on the highest point of a narrow north-south ridge, with the east and west slopes falling away steeply to the drainages below. The south end of the ridge descended gradually to a saddle, and then climbed again toward a higher peak 2 miles away. The north end dropped sharply, a rocky scramble down to a bench of old-growth larch and subalpine fir that ran along the contour at about 5,200 feet before the ridge resumed its descent. From the cab, you could see the bench clearly on the north windows, a dark strip of canopy about 200 yards wide, beginning perhaps 300 yards from the base of the tower. The bench was the part of the country that sounded different. Sound at altitude, in still weather, carries in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who has not experienced it. The valley far below generates a low, continuous murmur, wind in the timber, the creek, the occasional vehicle on the road. The immediate ridge produces its own sounds, the guy cables in a breeze, the structure settling, the birds. And the middle distance, the slopes and benches within a mile or so, produces a texture of ambient sound that you come to know as intimately as the visual landscape. Small aircraft occasionally, ravens always. In the evenings, coyotes in the lower drainages. In the mornings, a pair of Clark's nutcrackers that lived somewhere in the subalpine firs to the east and could be reliably heard at dawn. The bench to the north was quiet, not absolutely quiet. The wind moved through it, and the birds passed over it, but it was quieter than it should have been, given its size and composition and the density of life that a stand of old-growth larch typically supports. I noticed this, the way you notice a room in a house that is always a few degrees colder than the others, not dramatically, not as a single event, but as a cumulative impression that takes time to become conscious. I had been at the tower for about a month when I wrote in my journal, on a Tuesday evening in early June, "North bench quiet today." Again, not sure when I started tracking this. That entry is the beginning of what I can point to as a sequence. Before it, nothing. After it, a different quality of attention. I began to listen for the bench specifically. I would stand at the north window with my binoculars and sweep it during my regular watches, the same sweep I did in every direction, and I would listen while I looked. I could not see into it deeply. The canopy was closed and the interior was dark, and the binoculars showed me only the outer edge of the tree line, the larch trunks pale and vertical at the boundary, and beyond them, shadow. But I could hear the approximate boundary of normal forest sound, the way you can hear where a conversation is happening in the next room without hearing the words, and the bench was, consistently, on the wrong side of that boundary, not silent, just less than it should have been, less birdsong, less wind rustle, even when the wind was clearly moving through the adjacent timber, a compression of sound, as though the bench occupied a slightly different acoustic environment than everything around it. I told myself it was topographic. Sound moves strangely over ridges and through drainages, and a bench at a certain elevation, backed by a rock face, could produce a sound shadow, a zone where ambient noise was absorbed or deflected rather than transmitted. This is real. It happens. I have no meteorology training, but I have enough basic sense to know that terrain and sound are not simple, and that absence of sound is not evidence of anything except acoustics. I told myself this, and I recorded my daily weather and my smokes, of which there were 4 that month. 3 campfire reports that turned out to be allowed burns, 1 legitimate detection that I am still quietly proud of, a small lightning ignition on a slope 12 miles south that I caught within 20 minutes of the strike. The work was real. The work was good. I was good at the work, and the work was good for me, and I want you to understand that the month of June, despite the bench, was the best month I had experienced in years. The structure helped. The rhythm helped. The simplicity of the task, watch, log, report, was a relief after the complexity of the life I had left, and I felt, in those weeks, something approaching contentment. I am not saying this to suggest that what came later was a product of my mental state. I am saying it because it is true, and because the truth of it makes what came later harder to explain away. The first direct observation was on the 15th of June. I have the date from my journal. It was a clear day, moderate wind from the southwest, visibility excellent. I was doing my afternoon watch sweep, moving the binoculars methodically north, and I paused on the bench. I paused because I thought I saw movement at the tree line, not in the trees, at the edge of them, a displacement of shadow, a change in the quality of the dark at the boundary between the sunlit slope and the interior of the bench. I held the binoculars steady. I waited. The movement did not repeat. The edge of the tree line was still, and ordinary pale larch trunks, dark interior, exactly what it always was. I noted it in my log as a probable animal, black bear or white-tailed deer, both common on that slope. I moved on. The second observation was on the 19th, same time of day, same window, same tree line. This time I was not using binoculars. I was looking with the naked eye, standing close to the north glass, and the movement I saw was not a displacement of shadow. It was something stepping back. The impression was brief, and I will not overstate its clarity. What I perceived, at a distance of 300 yards, was the edge of a shape withdrawing into the shadow of the tree line. A vertical shape, long enough and proportioned in a way that made my mind, in the fraction of a second before I could form a thought about it, produce the word person. I stayed at the window for a long time. Nothing moved. I took up the binoculars and swept the tree line in detail, as slowly as I could manage, examining each section of visible trunk and shadow. There was nothing there, no animal visible, no figure, nothing. I wrote in my journal that evening, something at North Bench tree line, 1540, vertical, withdrew quickly, possibly deer, possibly a person, no trail there. Check topo, no trail within a mile of that bench on the north slope. Dispatch says no permitted activity in that drainage, probably deer. I believed probably deer. It is the right explanation. A deer seen from 300 yards, at the edge of a tree line, in a moment of peripheral vision, will look vertical and large and proportioned wrongly, because you are seeing only a fragment of it and your mind is doing the rest. I have been told this by people who know more about visual perception than I do, and I believe them, and I believed it then, and I put the journal down, and I ate my dinner, and I did not think about the bench for the rest of the evening. But I thought about it in the morning, and in the morning I did something I had not done before. I climbed down from the tower and walked to the bench. The hike was 20 minutes, downhill on the north slope, through shin-high grass and scattered rock. The slope was open for most of the descent, transitioning to the bench at the tree line, in a clear, abrupt boundary. Grass to larch, sunlight to shade, in the space of 3 steps. I went in under the canopy, and I stood still, and I let my eyes adjust. The interior of the bench was what old-growth larch always is, spacious and dark, the lower trunks clear of branches for 30 feet, the canopy a continuous ceiling of needles far above, the ground soft with decades of duff and the fallen larch needles that accumulate into a deep, rust-colored mat. It was cool. It smelled of resin and earth and the particular mineral dampness of old timber. It was beautiful, in the understated way that old growth is beautiful, which is to say it was large and quiet and indifferent. I walked the interior for about half an hour. I was looking for signs of use, a campsite, a fire ring, a game trail worn enough to suggest regular travel. I found none of these things. What I found, about 100 yards into the bench from the south edge, was a tree. I want to be careful about this. What I found was a larch, like all the others, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, easily 200 years old. It was not unusual in any structural sense. What was unusual was the area around its base. The duff there was disturbed, not significantly, not as though a large animal had bedded there, or a person had camped there, but in the way that duff is disturbed when something has been standing in a spot for a long time, shifting weight, pressing down. A compression of the mat, roughly circular, roughly 18 inches across, at the base of the north side of the trunk. Just the duff pressed down, no tracks in it, no mark in the bark, no sign that could be logged and reported, just a place where something had stood. I crouched and looked at it for a while. I stood and looked up the trunk. I walked around the tree once and saw nothing else. I walked back out of the bench, up the slope, up the ladder, into the cab, and I sat down in my chair by the fire finder, and I looked out the north window at the tree line. The bench was quiet. I wrote in my journal that night, walked to north bench. Old growth larch, good canopy, no sign of regular use. One tree with disturbed duff at base. Circular compression. Not a bed, not tracks. Something standing, maybe, or nothing. The ground does that. Could be anything. Could be nothing. Over the next 2 weeks I went back 4 times. Each time the compressed area at the base of the larch was there, unchanged, consistent in size and location. Each time I looked for any additional sign, and found none. Each time I walked back up to the tower, and looked out the north window, and found the bench unchanged, silent, unremarkable. I was beginning to feel the specific frustration of a person who has noticed something that will not resolve into either significance or insignificance, who cannot confirm that there is anything to explain, and cannot stop trying to explain it. The radio check on the morning of July the 3rd changed the texture of this. The dispatch voice that morning was a woman I recognized. She had a particular way of clipping the end of the call sign, a small verbal habit I'd come to associate with her, and she was typically brief and practical. That morning she was brief and practical in the usual way, and then, at the end of the check, she said, "How are you finding it up there, Garnet?" I said, "Fine." I said the weather had been good. She said, and I am recounting this from memory, that she was glad, and that the previous occupant, she said the previous occupant, not Dell's name, had found the posting difficult in his last season, and that she hoped I was settling in. I said I was. I asked carefully what she meant by difficult. There was a pause, a short one, the kind that happens when someone is deciding how much to say. She said, "He started logging things that weren't smokes." I waited. She said, "In the official log, he'd enter coordinates for something he was watching, and when we'd follow up, there was nothing there. Happened a few times. We thought it was fatigue. It happens." I thanked her. She said, "Have a good watch day." The radio went to static. I looked at Dell's logbook. I had read it when I arrived, in the way you read a handover document, looking for practical information, and I had found it unremarkable. I read it again now, more slowly. The entries from his first 2 seasons were short and regular, and precisely what an official fire lookout log should be. The entries from his 3rd season started the same way, and then, in August, something changed. The entries became longer. Some of them contained bearing coordinates, the same format used to report a smoke, a degree bearing, and an estimated distance, but with no report designation, no smoke classification, no color or behavior description. Just the coordinates, logged at irregular times, mostly late afternoon and evening. I counted them. There were 11 across the last 6 weeks of his final season. None of them were followed by a follow-up entry. No confirmed campfire, no permitted burn, no resolution, just the coordinates, hanging in the log like questions. I plotted the bearings on my copy of the topo. A smoke bearing taken from the tower, combined with an estimated distance, gives a point on the map, imprecise, but locatable within a quarter mile if the estimation is good. All 11 of Dell's unresolved entries resolved to the same quarter-mile area: the north bench, the old-growth larch, the tree. I sat with this for a long time. I sat with it the way I had sat with the compressed duff, and with the silence, and with the vertical shape at the tree line, understanding that each individual thing was explicable, and that all of them together were pointing at something I could not name, and that naming it was not the problem, that the problem was simpler and more physical than naming. The problem was that whatever had been on that slope had been there the season before me, and the season before that if Dell had noticed it in August of his 3rd year, and that it had been watched from this tower for at least 1 full season without being identified or resolved, and that it was still there, because the duff at the base of the tree was still compressed, and the bench was still quiet, and I had seen something at the tree line that I could not explain. The 4th of July brought a thunderstorm that sat over the ridge for 6 hours. Lightning struck the south guy cable twice, and both times the current ran through the tower structure, and I felt it in the metal chair legs as a high, brief vibration, a sound more than a sensation, as though the tower itself had spoken. The storm suppressed fire risk and gave me nothing to watch for, and so I watched the north bench through the rain, which reduced visibility to less than 100 yards, and I saw nothing, and the rain on the glass made a sound that was steady and white, and that covered everything beneath it. After the storm, in the late afternoon, when the clouds had moved east and the light had gone golden and long across the ridge, I stood at the north window with my binoculars. The bench was wet, the larch trunks were dark with moisture. The grass on the slope between the tower and the tree line was pressed flat in places by the rain, and the pressed grass caught the light and gleamed. There was a path in the grass, not a trail, not a worn track, a path in the pressed flat post-rain grass, a continuous line of slightly more flattened stems running from the tree line uphill toward the base of the tower. The rain had pressed all the grass down, but this line was pressed further, pressed into the soft, wet ground beneath, the way a path is pressed when weight has traveled it repeatedly over time, and the rain had revealed it by making everything else equally flat, so that the additional depression of the path was visible as a slightly darker line of grass, perhaps 18 inches wide, leading from the edge of the larch canopy straight up the open slope to the base of the tower ladder. I looked at it for a long time. I looked at it until the light failed, and I could no longer distinguish it from the surrounding slope. In the morning it was gone. The grass had dried and lifted, and the slope was uniform and unremarkable, and I could not find the line, though I walked the slope and looked for it on hands and knees in 2 places where I thought I remembered it passing. Nothing, just grass and rock and the thin soil of a subalpine slope that showed nothing and remembered nothing. But I had seen it. I had seen it for 20 minutes in the afternoon light, and I had looked at it long enough to be certain of its direction, its width, its regularity. It went from the tree to the tower. Whatever came out of the bench at night, or whenever it came up the slope to the base of the tower. It stood at the base of the tower. It did not climb. There were no scratch marks on the ladder uprights, no wear on the rungs beyond what use by one person over one season produces. It stood at the base of the tower, and then it returned to the bench, and it had been doing this, based on the depth of the compression in the path, for longer than one season. I called dispatch, not on the emergency frequency, on the regular check-in, the evening call. I told the voice, a man I didn't know, that I had a question about wildlife in the drainage. He said, "Go ahead." I asked whether there had been any reports of unusual animal behavior on the north slope of the Garnet Peak Ridge, any complaints from hunters in the fall, any incident reports. He said he'd have to check and get back to me. I said thank you. He said good night. He did not get back to me. I slept badly. I slept in the way that I had come to recognize as my standard sleep at the tower, which was a light and easily disrupted sleep in which I was never fully unaware of the space around me, the glass walls, the darkness outside, the altitude. But this night was worse. I woke at intervals and lay still in the cot and listened. The tower at night has its own sounds. The cables in the wind, the structure settling, the occasional skitter of a bird on the roof. I knew all of these sounds. What I heard on this night was the sounds I expected, and then, in the earliest hours of the morning, before the sky began to lighten, a sound I did not expect. A pressure on the ladder. Not a footstep, not a creak of someone climbing. A pressure, the barely perceptible change in the tower's movement that occurs when weight is applied to one of its elements. I knew this sound because I knew the tower. I knew what it felt like when I stepped onto the bottom rung of the ladder from inside the cab. I knew the resonance of the structure, the way my weight changed it, the way the cables took up the difference. This was a resonance from below, from the base, weight applied to the bottom of the ladder, from outside, and then held, not climbing, standing. The way the compressed duff described standing, the way the path described arriving, something at the base of the ladder, in the dark, at the bottom of the structure, 60 feet below where I lay on the cot. I did not move. I lay still, and I breathed, and I listened. The pressure held for a time I cannot accurately estimate. It might have been 5 minutes, it might have been 20, and then it released, gently, and the tower's natural resonance returned, and I heard, very faintly, the grass on the slope, accepting weight as something moved back down toward the bench. I did not sleep again. When it was light enough to see, I went to the trapdoor, and I looked down through the gap at the ground 60 feet below, and I saw nothing. I descended the ladder, and I looked at the bottom rung, and I looked at the ground at the base of the structure. The ground there was rock and compacted soil, and it held no impression. I looked up the ladder from the bottom, with my head tilted back, looking up through the rungs at the trapdoor, and I thought about the fact that for some period of the previous night, something had been standing where I was standing, looking up at the same trapdoor, with me on the other side of it. I climbed back up. I made coffee. I took my weather observation. I logged it in the official log. I did not log what I had heard. I did not log it because the official log was not the right place for it, and because I was not yet certain of what I had heard, and because I had a professional responsibility to the log's accuracy that I was not willing to compromise with something I could not verify. I logged it in my journal. I logged it in detail. I logged the time, the duration, the quality of the sound, my interpretation of it. I logged the path in the grass from the previous afternoon. I logged Dell's unresolved bearings. I wrote, at the end of the entry, a question that I had been circling for days and had not written until now. Is it watching the tower, or is it watching me? This distinction matters. I want to explain why it matters. A thing that watches a structure is a thing that responds to something fixed, a shelter, a source of smell or sound or light. Animals do this. Bears investigate structures routinely. A thing that watches a person is something with a different kind of attention, an attention that follows the person rather than the place, an attention that is oriented toward a particular living presence rather than an inanimate feature of the landscape. The distinction between these two things is the distinction between a behavior that is explicable and a behavior that is not, and I was not able, from the data I had, to determine which one I was looking at. But the question, once written, did not go away. I changed my behavior. I am a practical person, and when something is uncertain and potentially significant, the practical response is to gather more information. I began to keep a specific record of every observation that related to the bench or the north slope, time, conditions, what I saw or heard, duration. I marked the compressed duff at the base of the tree with a small stone arrangement so that I could detect any change without disturbing it. I began to note the tower's resonance at night with the same attention I gave the daytime watch. Over the next 3 weeks, The record I kept showed the following. On 11 of 22 nights, I detected a pressure resonance from the base of the tower, occurring between midnight and 3 in the morning, lasting between 10 minutes and, on the longest occasion, what I estimated as 45 minutes. On 6 of the 11 nights, I heard the displacement of the grass on the return to the bench. The stone arrangement at the base of the tree was not disturbed. On 2 occasions I saw the shape at the tree line in the late afternoon, once at 300 yards through binoculars, and once, on a day when I had walked partway down the slope for no reason I can clearly explain, at roughly 120 yards with the naked eye. The second naked eye observation is the one I need to describe. I had walked down the slope on a Tuesday afternoon, in good weather, without the binoculars. I had told myself I was checking the water pipe from the spring, which runs along the lower east slope, and which I inspected regularly. This was true. I was checking the pipe. I was also, I think, doing what I had been doing for weeks, which was moving toward the thing rather than away from it, the way you move toward a sound in the dark, because the uncertainty of not knowing where it is feels worse than the risk of finding it. I had walked past the spring and continued downslope, and then along the contour toward the north, and I had stopped at a point about 100 yards from the tree line, in the open grass, in full sun, and I had looked at the bench. The shape was at the edge of the canopy. It was inside the tree line by perhaps 10 feet, standing behind a larch trunk in a way that put most of it in shadow, and what I could see was a section of it visible in the gap between 2 trunks. I will tell you what I saw with as little elaboration as possible, because elaboration is where perception and interpretation blur, and I want to be precise. I saw something tall, taller than the larch trunks at the height I was looking, meaning taller than 6 feet, though this is a rough estimate given the distance and the shadow. It was standing still. It was oriented toward me. I could not see a face or features. I could see, in the gap between the trunks, a vertical form in the shadow that was darker than the shadow around it, and that did not move while I was looking at it, and that was too still and too vertical and too large to be a deer or a bear or any animal I could name from that observation. I stood still as well. We were, for perhaps a minute, very still, and looking at each other across 100 yards of open slope in the afternoon sun. Then a cloud crossed the sun, and the light changed, and when it returned, the gap between the trunks was empty. I walked back to the tower. I climbed the ladder. I sat in the chair by the firefinder. I did not record the observation in the official log. I sat for a long time, and then I opened my journal, and I wrote, saw it, properly, 1422, approx 120 yards. It was looking at me. And then, below this, a line I did not plan to write, that appeared under the pen, the way thoughts sometimes arrive fully formed. It knew I was coming down the slope before I did. I cannot justify this. I have no evidence for it. But the quality of its stillness, the way it was already in that gap between the trunks when I arrived at the point on the slope where I could see it, the orientation of it, these things assembled, in the moment of writing, into that sentence, and I have not been able to take it back, not because I insist it is true, because I cannot verify that it is false. I called dispatch the following morning, and I asked, directly, about the previous occupant. I did not ask about Dell specifically. I did not use the name, because I was not sure the name I had constructed from the logbook handwriting was even correct. I asked whether the person who had staffed Garnet Peak before me had completed their full contract. There was a pause. The voice said the previous occupant had requested a transfer at the end of August, 1 month before season close. I asked why. The voice said personnel records weren't something they discussed over the radio. I said I understood. The voice asked whether everything was all right at the station. I said yes. I said the weather had been good. I want to say something about the quality of those weeks, after the direct observation, because I think the quality of them is the most important thing I can convey, and the most difficult. I was not afraid. This will seem strange, and I have thought about it since, and I think the reason I was not afraid is that fear requires a threat, and what I had observed was not a threat. It had not approached me. It had not made any action toward me. It had stood at the base of my tower, in the dark, and then left. It had stood in the forest and watched me walk down a slope. These are not the actions of a thing that means harm. They are the actions of something curious or cautious, or something with a relationship to this place and this structure that preceded my presence in it, and that my presence had not changed. I was not the first person it had watched from the bench. I was simply the current one. This understanding, if understanding is the right word, did not make me comfortable, but it changed the quality of the unease. It stopped being the unease of prey and became something harder to name. The unease of being studied, of being known by something you do not know, of being, for the first time in years, genuinely and thoroughly seen by something outside yourself, and not being able to determine whether that seeing was benign. In August, 2 things happened. The first was small. I came down the ladder one morning and found, on the bottom rung, a piece of larch bark, a curved piece, pale grey on the outer surface, the inner surface resinous and aromatic, roughly the size of my hand. It had not been there the evening before. It was not placed carefully. It was simply on the rung, resting there, the way something rests on a surface when it has been set down and not arranged. I picked it up and I smelled it, and I looked at it, and I put it on the table inside the cab, and I looked at it for most of that day between watch sweeps. It is the kind of bark that falls from larch trees naturally. Larch has a distinctive plated bark that sheds in irregular pieces, and a piece of it on the ground is unremarkable. A piece of it on the bottom rung of a tower ladder, 8 inches off the ground, is not where bark falls. It is where bark is placed. The second thing was a conversation. Late August, a resupply mule came up with a ranger from the district, a woman I had not met, who brought my food and checked on the station in the routine way. She was thorough and pleasant, and as she was preparing to head back down, I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether there was any local knowledge about the North Bench. She stopped. She looked at me. She asked what I meant. I said I'd noticed it was quiet up there. Acoustically unusual. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she'd heard some of the people who had worked the tower mention the north slope, that it was a thing people tended to notice. I asked whether anyone had ever identified what caused it. She looked at the bench for a moment, from where we were standing at the base of the tower, and she said, "The Salish have names for places like this, places that are paying attention. We just don't have a protocol for it." She hiked back down the trail. I stood at the base of the tower, and I looked at the bench, and the bench was still, and the larch trunks were pale in the afternoon sun, and I thought about paying attention, about what it means for a place to be paying attention, about whether a place and a thing in a place are the same thing or different things, and I did not reach a conclusion. I finished my season. I hiked out on the 1st of October, in light snow, with my pack and my journal and the piece of larch bark, which I had kept on the table for the full remainder of the season, and which I carried out without deciding to, the way you carry out things that have become part of a space. On my last evening, I stood at the north window in the last light, and I looked at the bench, and the bench was still, and the bench was quiet, and I said nothing aloud, because there was nothing to say, and I went to bed. In the morning, before I climbed down, I looked at the logbook. I was going to make a final entry: weather, station status, notes for the next occupant. I wrote the weather. I wrote the station status, which was good. I noted the water tank level, the propane supply, a small crack in the west window frame that should be addressed before next season. And then I sat with the pen, and I thought about Dell's entries, the coordinates that had pointed to the bench, and I thought about the ranger's phrase, and I thought about the compressed duff, and the path in the grass, and the pressure on the ladder, and the bark on the rung, and the shape in the shadow between the trunks, and I thought about whoever would come next, whoever would climb this ladder in May, and open this logbook, and begin to notice the bench. I did not write what I had experienced. I could not write it in the official log, because the official log was not the place for it, and because writing it would make it a report, and a report requires a classification, and I had no classification for what I had seen. Instead, in the margin of my final entry, in the same small handwriting that Dell had used for his note about the Osborne alignment, I wrote, "North Bench, pay attention." I climbed down the ladder in the snow. I hiked out. I drove back to Missoula, to the apartment, to the kitchen table that now had nothing on it. I put the larch bark on the windowsill. It is still there. I look at it sometimes, the way you look at an object that you know is ordinary and that carries something that will not simplify. A piece of bark, a thing that sheds from trees, a thing that was on a rung. I think about the tower. I think about it in the specific way that I think about places I have left and that have not, in the leaving, become smaller. The tower is there now, closed for the season, the cab locked, the windows dark, the guy cables tight in the October wind. The bench is there. Whatever is in the bench is there. It is not waiting for me, because I do not think it works that way. It is simply present, the way it has been present through all the seasons that preceded mine, and will be present through all the seasons that follow, watching the tower, watching the ridge, watching whoever climbs the ladder in the spring and stands at the north window and begins, after enough still days with nothing to observe, to notice the silence. I have thought, many times, about whether I should have gone into the bench at night, whether I should have waited at the tree line after dark, or set up any means of observation more deliberate than a man at a window. I chose not to. I made this choice, I think, for two reasons. The first is that I did not want a confrontation, because a confrontation would have required one of us to be in the wrong place, and I was not certain that I was not the one in the wrong place, in the bench, in the dark, in a part of the mountain that was not mine. The second reason is harder to say. The second reason is that I did not want it to stop. I did not want to resolve the watching into something finite and explained, because the watching, for all its strangeness, was the thing I had gone to the mountain for without knowing it. The thing that had been watching me, night after night, from 60 feet below the glass, was the first presence I had felt in years that was entirely, uncomplicatedly real. It did not need anything from me. It asked nothing. It was simply there, and it was paying attention. And in a year when I had been invisible to everyone, including myself, being seen by something in the dark was not nothing. This is the part I have not told anyone, not because it is shameful, because it sounds like the wrong response to the wrong thing, and maybe it is. But it is what I have, and it is true, and the bark is on the windowsill, and in the spring someone will climb the ladder and open the logbook and read the margin note, and they will not know what it means, and they will begin to find out. That concludes tonight's file. If you've ever experienced something strange or unexplained, I'd love to hear your story. You can share it in the comments, or send it to the email in the description. It might become a future case on Midnight Files. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe and join me for more documentary-style horror stories. Until next time, stay curious. And remember, sometimes the things we can't explain are the ones we never forget.